Yeah, more or less. Okay, okay. Well, I'll take it slowly. Okay, so first let me explain what multi-concurrent proposers are. And let me explain it with two different consensus protocols. Who's not familiar with consensus protocols? Or what is consensus? Okay, so yeah, for those of you who are not familiar, consensus protocols are at the core of blockchain designs. They're what decide the ordering of transactions. And I'm gonna argue that single leader, which are the typical traditional consensus protocols for BFT chains, give too much power of ordering to the leader. So we have it here at the bottom, an example of a leader-based design. So we have the leader, in this case, process 0, proposer 0, proposing a value, and then there's 2 rounds of voting, and the value is decided, right? At the top, we have an example of a multi-concurrent proposer design, where we have 4 different proposers, each proposing a different value, and then there's some consensus protocol that decides some of them to be included in some particular order, and some of them not to be included. So there's no single leader that controls ordering of the transactions. And this is a very popular design at the moment, MCP chains. There's SUI, there's Aptos, there's Hedera, now Solana's latest consensus proposal from last week. So the upgrade to Alpenglow is also based on MCP. With Ethereum, as I said, we have Fossil, which is kind of a step in that direction. We have Braids, which is explicit multi-concurrent proposer design for Ethereum. And the reason is because it provides censorship resistance. And for some definition of privacy, it could provide, well, not privacy, but it can provide MVP protection. I'm going to argue, however, okay, who thinks that multi-concurrent proposers, like is set typically by the Solana guys, by the Aptos guys, etc., is a solution for MVP protection or for censorship, again, like to provide censorship resistance? Who thinks that is enough? Okay, good. So yeah, I agree with you guys. I don't think it's enough. And the reason is because of this 3-way trade-off. So if I'm a user and I want my transaction to get included and not get censored, what I can do is, if I have a multi-concurrent proposer design, I send the transaction to one proposer at a time, right? And that gives me the guarantee that I'm not going to pay for the transaction more than once. And if the proposer doesn't include it in this lot, then in the next lot, I try a different proposer, right? This is something that you can already do in Ethereum because you have rotating leaders. If I want to exploit some low latency opportunity, I don't know, I see some arbitrage opportunity and it's either now or never, I can send a transaction, and if it doesn't get included, then I don't try anymore because that opportunity is gone, but then I don't get censorship resistance, right? I get low latency, but I don't get censorship resistance. And if I want both, then because it's a multi-concurrent proposer design, then I send a transaction to all the proposers, and then I'm guaranteed that unless all of them are trying to censor me, as long as one is not trying to censor me, I can include the transaction. But somebody has to pay for that, because that transaction is gonna, if I want censorship resistance against F proposers, then I need to send a transaction to F+1 proposers, which means that somebody has to pay F+1 times the price of including that transaction. And there's 2 different designs. On one side, we have the SUI guys, for example, like in production, we have the SUI guys, the Aptos guys, or Filecoin, which Filecoin is also an MCP chain, where the cost of including that transaction is absorbed by the system, is subsidized by the system. So effectively what it means is that the user is only charged once, but he can include the transaction 100 times, for example, which means that the goodput, if the throughput of the system is 1,000 transactions per second, then it reduces to a goodput, a useful throughput of 10 transactions per second. And then on the other side, in production, we have Hedera that says, hey, we provide this multi-concurrent proposer design. You can use it to leverage censorship resistance, but you're going to pay for it. And so if a user wants to get censorship resistance against 99 proposers, he's going to have to pay for the transaction 100 times. So yeah, it's censorship resistance, but it's not really affordable, is it? Also, a note that the reason why this is, well, to answer the original question that I did, is Ethereum or this chain censorship resistant? It actually depends, right? It depends on your assumptions on the adversary and whatnot. We are seeing in Ethereum big MEV being extracted, from users, so it's an obvious answer that it's not really that censorship resistant or MEV protected. In these chains, the way this is actually alleviated is with a trusted RPC, right? So is the RPC the one that selects which proposer to send the transaction to and for how many duplicates. And that's why we're not seeing an attack vector in which the goodput is reduced by 100x in these chains. But that is trusted. And so in a way, I see the evolution of providing censorship resistance in blockchains in these steps. So first we have the traditional step of leader-based consensus. From there, some people in the space argued we can do better with MCP, providing censorship resistance. and we could say the SUI, Aptos, and Falcon guys are there. Then the Hedera guys realize, oh, this is an attack vector. If we really want to do this in a trustless way, we need to charge users for this. And then finally, realizing that this is too high a cost for users to pay and try to alleviate this cost. And this is the work that I'm going to be presenting that I'm doing at SEI. Although actually it was SEI with some collaborators, researchers from SEI. And so here's the solution. It's very simple. The traditional way, as I said, of getting censorship-resistant benefits from a user would be to just replicate the transaction and send it to different proposers. And then, as long as one of them proposes it to be included in the blockchain, we're good. Which that means is to get a censorship resistance that protects you against a linear number of proposers, you need to pay a linear number of fees. And the good part of the system is reduced linearly as well. What we propose is sharding, so the transaction is sharded into smaller chunks, smaller pieces, sent to different proposers, such that as long as enough of these proposers include their chunks, you can reconstruct the transaction. And so as a result, you get the same, or like, you get the same tolerance in the linear number of proposers for censorship resistance, but you pay a constant cost. And you also get a constant fraction of the throughput in goodput. So it's a street improvement in these terms. So I have a presentation on Thursday about how this protocol works in particular, and the Bayesian default tolerance on the protocol, etc. I'm gonna just kind of like skip through that now to get into the economics. So what is the MEV cost? The MEV protection cost using Sedna, using the solution of sharding. So for that, let's first define the problem and apply the protocol in a naive way. So we have here a number of proposers, a user that is sharding his transactions, sending it to different proposers, such that if enough of them include their chunks, we reconstruct the transaction. Now, what the attacker can do is, we have a coalition, a cartel of a number of proposers that is going to try to reconstruct the transaction with the chunks privately before it's on-chain in order to exploit MEV. Because if they just get some chunks, they cannot really know the content of the transaction. So instead of sharing and then they can decide also to censor or not, to not share the chunks. So for example, here, one of the members of the cartel, of the coalition, decides not to include their chunk. But because there were more chunks than needed, the transaction is still reconstructed. This is what we call a slack of one. So one chunk can be not included, and still the transaction can be reconstructed. What about two? So now with two, the number of chunks that have been included on-chain is not enough to reconstruct the transaction. So at that point, censorship has occurred. And also, the cartel can privately share the chunks, as I said, and reconstruct the transaction on their end, and they get one extra slot where they can, basically extract MEV from this transaction. And here we analyze also two different risks that can occur with Sedna, or like that are not fully solved by Sedna, by this sharding solution. One is the multi-slot one, which is the one that I've shown. The transaction gets censored, and so you need one more slot of consensus, one more round of consensus in order to include the transaction. The other one is the within slot delay. So even if the transaction is gonna make it on-chain in that same slot, if the cartel, if the coalition is very well connected, they might still manage to get the chunks first, reconstruct it on time, and wait for that, and then once they have reconstructed the transaction, make their own proposal knowing the content of the transaction to try and still front-run that transaction. So we analyzed the two of them. The first thing that we notice is this very interesting kind of like inverse sawtooth where, so the user has a lot of parameters that he can tweak to its benefit, It's a user-facing protocol. The user can decide how many chunks to split the transaction into, to how many lanes to share, to how many proposers to send chunks, how many chunks per proposer, etc. What we see is the important parameter is what I was calling the slack, right? The slack is how many extra chunks the user can tolerate to not be included and still reconstruct the transaction. So the interesting bit is that as the slack, so in this case we have 100 proposers. The user is going to choose 20 of them at random per round of consensus. And we assume the cartel, the coalition, is also controlling 20 lanes, some of the 100, 20 of the 100. And here at the bottom, the x-axis is the decode threshold. So how many chunks are needed to reconstruct the transaction. So one thing that is interesting is Here before, I was explaining in the case of one round. But you can actually, the user could actually, and it's actually beneficial for the user, to split the transaction across rounds. So basically to require more chunks that he sends in one round. But what we see here is like kind of like a frequent pattern that repeats over the slack. So over basically the number of chunks needed for the construction modulus the number of lanes that are contacted. And what is interesting is here Q micro is the probability of the attackers managing to get enough chunks to reconstruct the transaction within one slot before it's included, even if censorship doesn't happen. And for this one, as the decode threshold gets closer, so the decode threshold gets closer to a slack of 0, actually the probability decreases. Whereas for the multi-slot delay, happens the opposite. The higher the slack, the harder it is for the attackers to delay the transaction by one slot. Because, for example, if the slack is 19, and I send, that means that I send a transaction to 19 extra proposers in this slot. So I can afford 19 of them to censor, if one includes it. So it's really hard to delay one multiple slot. But that also means that that I only need one extra chunk to reconstruct the transaction. So it's a lot easier if that extra chunk, one of those 20 belongs to the coalition, it's very easy for them to reconstruct the transaction quickly. So it's kind of like an inverse sawtooth. But this is the strawman approach. So what else can we do from the user-facing protocol in order to protect more the user? The first one is what we call the ratchet strategy. A ratchet, for those of you who are not native in English like me, is a tool that you kind of like a screw in one direction, but you cannot really go in the direction contrary. So everything that you gain in terms of screwing, of tightening, you gain it forever, kind of. And so that's kind of like the same approach. As I said, that we have this like situation where the user can decide to require more slots preemptively as protection. The reason why this is beneficial is because the attackers don't know how many shards are needed for reconstruction. It's not a parameter. They know once they reconstruct, but if they don't manage to reconstruct, they don't know if there's one more needed or 10 more needed. So they have to take kind of like a decision in darkness. And what the user can do is it can send some shards such that even if all of them are included on chain, the transaction still does not reconstruct. And if some of the shards are not included, the user immediately learns, oh, these people are malicious. You know, these people are intentionally not including my chunks. So in the next iteration, I'm not gonna message them. So in every new round that someone censors me, I immediately learn this person is censoring me. So I'm not gonna contact this person anymore. And doing that, you can actually see that the probability of delay actually really, really decays when you have high slack. So basically, there's no benefit for the attacker in the multi-slot delay from delaying. In the multi-slot case, from delaying farther. Yeah, well, this is pretty much everything I've said on this. Then here's another realization about this kind of like a different way to analyze the problem, but also a different way to exploit the problem. So there's two ways that you can, in general, in distributed game theory, there's two ways that you can analyze an adversary. You can say, oh, this is different virtual proposers, all controlled by the same entity. So there's one person behind that is selfish. Or you could say, these are actually different people that just get together because they can exploit more the user, but they are all independently selfish. You know, they commonly known as no honor among thieves. You know, I'm with you. Just if I can screw you, I'm gonna screw you as well, even though I'm with you for the moment. And in the second case, which is more realistic, where you have the different real people that are colluding together selfishly, it's interesting because there's an asymmetry on the attackers. In this case, two of them must not include their chunk, their shard, for the censorship event to occur. But the third one includes his shard, so it gets a double benefit. It gets the MEV benefit, like the others, from reconstructing privately the transaction, but it also gets the benefit from the fees, whereas the others don't get that benefit. So there's an interesting asymmetry there that kind of like creates, if you can exploit it properly enough, you can create kind of like a prisoner's dilemma. Like, let me explain here. Kind of like a prisoner's dilemma that you can exploit even further with what we call pivot K. So pivot K is, so a fee in a shard, like in any transaction, is given when the transaction is included, right? If you include the transaction, I get the fee for the transaction. Pivot K says, is a special fee that is only paid for the shards that are strictly needed for the reconstruction. So it might be that we include more shards that we need to reconstruct in the chain. And in that case, they get the normal fee, but those extra shards do not get the pivot K bounty, the pivot K fee. So we're putting more pressure on malicious attackers, not only to include the shard, but to include it in a way that is relevant to reconstruction. And so here will be the example. So we have, imagine we include K plus D shards, but we only need K. So the ones who get the bounty are only the first K. And this is an interesting thing. That is what we call a baiting strategy. So it's a type of punishment strategy. So it's known in distributed game theory, the notion of a punishment strategy is a strategy that honest people can enforce such that the threat of it already is enough for the attackers to not misbehave in the first place, right? Similar to how people don't commit a crime because they can go to prison. A baiting strategy is a type of punishment strategy that requires collaboration from within the criminal group to succeed. Similar to, I don't know, if there is a criminal group that is very, very powerful in a society, you kind of like need them to break apart first, right? You take some fish in them and tell them, okay, if you collaborate with us, we cannot free you, but we get to catch the rest. So it's kind of like the same strategy. And doing that, what we see is that, I have some time. So yeah, what we see here is, for example, in the orange line over there, means that for these parameters of, this is for a transaction of a value of 500, whatever you want to call it, 500 tokens. And the MEV extractable, if the transaction can be reconstructed and exploited, is 100. And so what we see here is that for a bounty of 20, already there's some moments, there's some decode threshold under which just the bounty is enough to disincentivize the coalition from misbehaving. So we're just with a coalition of 20 tokens, we can already secure a transaction whose extractable value is 100 and whose real value is 500. And it's actually going to be much more dramatic later on. This is just a specific example. Actually, I don't think I have too much time, so let me go forward a bit. Yeah, okay, so here's some examples. Here is probably the most interesting thing here that we haven't mentioned yet, is first how the worst case scenario is to have a very long honest horizon. The honest horizon will be the number of rounds of consensus that are needed in order to reconstruct the transaction in the best case. So if everyone is honest, the user has created so many chunks that it takes, let's say, in the bottom line, bottom row, second column, 5. It takes 5 rounds of consensus to actually reconstruct the transaction. If the user has a high honest horizon and a 0 slack, meaning that it cannot tolerate just one chart not being included, that's the worst case scenario, right? The probability of delay is 1 in the naive case. And even with the ratchet strategy, it doesn't get much better. And so yeah, the bounty that you have to pay to the attackers to disincentivize misbehaving is very high. So in this case, it's $50 for a fee, for a transaction value of 100 tokens. However, if you use all the strategies that we have been discussing, just to give a sneak peek of the benefits that you can get with this, just 0.04% of the maximal extractable value from this transaction as a bounty is enough to disincentivize a cartel controlling 20% of all the proposers. So even if 20% of the proposers get together and say, hey guys, let's try and work together, share our shards so that we can extract value privately and do some sandwich attacks or whatever, just with a honest horizon of 2 and just distributing our shards between 30 lanes already gives the user protection. Let's say the user wants to create some trading transaction for let's go like crazy, $5 million, of which if somebody can see and exploit with a sandwich attack, they can extract $500,000, which is horrible, right? So in this case, to protect against that, you just need $2,000. So you just put a bounty of $2,000 and your transaction is against an attacker controlling 20% of the proposers, it doesn't pay off for them to attack the transaction. So these are the different cases that show depending on how many transactions, how many rounds, how high your honest horizon is, so how many rounds the transaction is going to take to be included, and what is the slack, how many chunks the user can admit not to be included while the transaction can still reconstruct, what are the benefits that you get. And so yeah, the best case scenario will be enforcing an honest horizon of 2, so splitting your transaction into shards, not send all the shards yet, send some of them in the first slot and some of them in the second slot, just to try and test out which proposals are behaving. And also make sure that you can still tolerate some of the shards not being included. So have a positive slack, a non-zero slack. And as I said, yeah, the MEV protection cost is 0.04% of the transaction value. Then as future work, I've been kind of lying up until now. So I said one of the properties, I've been talking mostly about censorship resistance and MEV protection and how that breaks if you can reconstruct the transaction. Well, it turns out, I mean, sharding does not give you perfect privacy. You know, there's always some leaking per shard that you get if they are smart about it. It's not secret sharing, it's not encryption. So we're working on a version that does some shuffling of the chunks, like deterministically, but non-predictable, in a non-predictable way, what we call non-linearity leaking. So basically, if you get a bunch of shards, as long as you are not close enough to reconstruction, you would not learn anything about the transaction. Oh, I forgot to say, again, this is not the Come Thursday if you want to know more about concrete numbers in terms of latency and whatnot. The reason why we don't do threshold decryption is because we're focusing on low latency for many applications, and threshold encryption and decryption is not going to be negligible latency, whereas sharding and reconstruction of transaction takes like a nanosecond, and it's a millisecond, and it's ridiculously parallelizable. Then we're still also looking into the economics of pricing the distribution of transactions. And another thing that we found that was very interesting that discouraged us from doing threshold encryption and decryption is that most threshold encryption schemes rely on some cryptographic assumptions that are not proven. And actually, we're working on a paper that disproves one of the assumptions, which means that effectively some of the properties of these threshold encryption schemes are actually broken. So yeah, that was all. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Alejandro? Okay, I have a question. You had, so during some of the claims, you said that, you know, at assuming a 20% cartel, right, in the proposers, what happens, you know, as you use that as a variable, right? So what happens if you go to like 33%, 35%, 40%? How dramatically does that impact the 0.04% of the transaction value that you're protecting?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, there's even more deep considerations to be made there. So it does increase, it especially increases dramatically. It also depends on how you analyze it. So if you do it again in a naive way, then it increases dramatically up to the 2/3 point, because over there they control everything. But actually, if the attackers already control more, like let's say you have a consensus protocol that is classical BFT, 3F+1 model, you know, you basically move forward as soon as you hear about 2/3 of the participants. In that case, an attacker controlling more than 1/3 of the participants, in some consensus protocols can actually censor lanes. So they already controlling more than 33% actually gives you a 66% control over lanes. So yeah, I didn't, especially for the econ paper, I didn't want to get too much into that, but we get a little bit more into that into the protocols paper. But yeah, it does get worse, especially once you get close to like more than 33%.
And then what about the other way? Like, what about 10%? Like, how quickly does it approach 0 when the cartel doesn't have too many participants?
I have not plotted that, so I don't know. I'm surely it's getting better, but I don't know how quickly. Yeah.
All right. Does anyone have any questions? Going once, going twice. Thank you, Alejandro.
Thank you.
Can I please invite Chris and Tiago to the stage, I think?